We all have our own natural weaknesses and limitations on our personal abilities. Maybe we are not bestowed with good skills at maths or languages, or we weren't built to be a runner. Maybe we have lots of ideas, but we aren't someone who would ever give a speech. However, as we explore the neuroscience of mindsets today, the question we'll be asking is, how much of these limitations are in our heads? To start with an inspiring story, Bethany Hamilton grew up in Hawaii and she dreamed of being a pro surfer. When she was 13, however, fate had some different ideas for her. She was paddling out when a 14-foot tiger shark took a giant bite out of her surfboard and her entire left arm along with it. And that feels like a pretty good reason to stop surfing, if you ask me. Also, there's the fact that only having one arm makes it a lot harder to do things like and also stand up on your board. And in fact, balancing is a lot harder without an arm. If you think about how a cat uses its tail for balancing, humans often use our arms to balance in the same way. So poor old Bethany was told that her surfing career was definitely over. But 4 weeks later, 13-year-old Beth surfed her first wave with one arm. And there were plenty of wipeouts, but it didn't stop her practicing and going to junior competitions. And by the age of 17, she turned pro and she went on to win several competitions and even beat world champions. Her journey inspiringly illustrates the concept of neuroplasticity and shows that the brain can adapt and overcome physical and mental limitations through determination, practice, and the growth mindset. And I thought it made a nice introduction to our discussion today on the neuroscience of mindsets. I want to cover how our experiences shape our brain architecture, influencing our abilities to learn and adapt, and dive more into what is really going on in our brain cells and brain circuitry. And of course, you might not want to be a pro surfer in shark-infested waters. I appreciate that. But you might want to get better at doing things you thought you were bad at, and you might just want to understand neuroscience and how brains work. We're going to look at two types of neuroplasticity and how they can help us reprogram our behaviors, and we will see how struggle and failure build powerful and creative changes in the brain. So, hello and welcome to the Growth Mindset Psychology Podcast with me, Sam Webster. We are studying the science of self-improvement and how our brains and behaviors are influenced by social behaviors, unconscious fears, along with learning some science-based tools to boost our learning potential and achieve our own definition of success, whatever that happens to be for you. So stay tuned. So firstly, what is the definition of the growth mindset? Well, Carol Dweck first discovered it and found that our ability to develop intelligence, talent, and potential is very much influenced by our belief that we can develop intelligence and potential, along with then choosing the right strategies, reflecting on our attempts, and putting in time and effort. And of course, people don't put in effort if they don't believe they can go anywhere. And that is the fixed mindset, where you believe that you are born with just fixed amounts of intelligence or talent, and that you can't develop your skills over time and that you're just stuck with what you have. Now, just because we know what the growth mindset and fixed mindset are, doesn't mean we instantly have a growth mindset. Carol Dweck gives a great example that we like to think of our champions and idols as superheroes. They were born different from us. We don't like to think of them as relatively ordinary people who made themselves extraordinary. It's easy to look at Michael Jordan, for example, and talk about his talent. It dismisses the fact that he was cut from his high school basketball team because he wasn't good enough. And he worked incredibly hard, and he outworked every other basketball player to become the best basketball player. He was an ordinary person who became extraordinary. And I'm going to expand a bit more on the fixed mindset, as it is quite nuanced, enough so that 60% of the world's population have a fixed mindset, even though no one really thinks they do. The fixed mindset is an ingrained feeling that learning new behaviors and skills should feel easy, natural, And it gives us a discomfort with being judged. We feel like failure is something we should avoid. And this belief structure becomes learned over time, as we're going to find out more later. If something doesn't come to us naturally, we fear that we are just inherently incapable of developing talent in the area. And it gets into our heads that if something is difficult or requires effort, that means we lack innate ability. Just believing that if something is hard, then we aren't good at it gives us the fixed mindset. And fascinatingly, young children all have a growth mindset naturally. In fact, until around ages 9 and 10, when they start to build more self-awareness as part of their brain development journey. And that is something else we're going to address later on. But firstly, something I want to make really clear is that not only is a fixed mindset an unhealthy belief to hold, it's actually completely incorrect from a scientific understanding of the brain. We can prove that your brain is capable of improving at any skill. It wasn't that long ago that scientists thought the human brain basically stopped developing after childhood, and that not much happened to it after that. And it's another one of our silly natural beliefs, like everyone used to believe the world was flat, and science needed to show us that that was wrong. The brain, we found, is constantly adapting and evolving by growing new pathways in relation to the experiences that we have. The different stimuli and events in our environment change us from the day that we're born to the day that we die. A really cool study on the brain used London black taxi drivers, and that's because they need to remember every single street of the megacity of London. And what they found was over a driver's training, their hippocampus, which is the main area of memories, actually grew by a significant volume. And I've always found this one of the coolest studies. They actually used London bus drivers as an experimental control because the bus drivers drive all day through London as well as the taxi drivers. But the bus drivers only go down the same fixed routes, so they aren't learning a lot of new information. And unsurprisingly, the bus drivers' brains didn't grow at all. And it is science like this that certainly makes me feel very positive about my out of control learning addiction, which is probably confirmation bias of me seeking things that I want to know, but we'll move on. There are 2 important points I really want to drive home today. The first is that experience shapes our brain architecture. We think of our genetic code, our genes, as being the creators of all the fundamental structures of our body. But when it comes to the brain, it's more like a set of instructions for how to build brain matter rather than exactly what neurons to lay where. Now, your genetics will influence certain natural capacities for processing different types of data, and you will have different advantages. But the specific wiring of the brain itself is purely built in response to what is happening to us. And that's not just that we form new memories from our experiences. We also form behaviors, decision-making pathways, and something that we call executive functioning. Specifically, the frontal and prefrontal cortex are the areas that are in charge of impulse control. We weigh our pros and cons of future consequences and where we do all our moral reasoning. And we aren't actually born with those skills. There's no specific gene coding for an exact replica of executive functioning from our parents. It's easy to imagine someone brought up in a radicalized environment of violence who would have very different executive functioning to someone raised in a very respective household. Or imagine Genghis Khan. He thought it was normal to slaughter his enemies and rape their wives. But if his genetic clone was born today, he'd probably be a little bit more chilled. Like just a small tad. And that's because our brains develop in response to our environment. In fact, the way the brain develops and grows is really fascinating. It mostly develops from the back to the front. The last region to be fully developed is the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for executive functioning, and that's at around age 25. It's only by this age that it becomes highly myelinated, and that's a process whereby neurons that fire repeatedly become established pathways of thought. Myelination is essentially when a neuron becomes covered in a sheath of fatty tissue that allows the neuron to fire much faster and directly. And as a very loose analogy, it's a bit like turning a dirt track into a highway. So when we look at the whole brain, we learn things like walking and speech very early in life, and those areas become myelinated, so we know what we're doing. But there are still massive features of the brain that are being developed for a long time by the experiences and conditions we go through as children and through early adulthood. And this leads right into the next point, that human development takes by far the longest in the animal kingdom. The level of nurture that we need to get to being a functional member of the species is incredible, partly because there's just so many more concepts and principles for our brain to build because it can hold so much more information. Now, if you think of some animals, they never even see their parents. Some fish and flies, they just hatch. They have all the hardware and software installed within them to go out and do the things they need to do to live their life. Now, most birds and mammals, they do have a nurture period, but it's the human being's nurture period that's most intense. I think elephants and whales are the only animals with slightly comparable levels of nature, and of course their brains are a lot bigger than ours even. But anyway, when I'm talking about hardware, that is our brain and body, the physical structures of ourself. And a lot of the hardware is actually built in the womb, and it continues to grow as we're kids. But we're born being able to see, feel, hear. Our digestion, breathing, circulation, they're all good to go. But the unique aspect of being a human is just how much software needs to be installed after we're born. It's not just knowledge like how to find food, what's safe to eat, and unique skills like language or even schooling in things like higher thought and mathematics and history. It's also knowledge like our emotions, attachment, and relationships. The software that we get is downloaded from generation to generation, and it's passed along through how we nurture the next generation and the other relationships and people in our life. These lessons begin very early, actually, whilst we are still in the womb. It's our first environment, and it's really important. The hormones, stress levels that are going through a mother do impact on the growing baby, as well as how she talks and responds to things. This, of course, continues after birth, and the first 6 months are the most important in terms of attachment styles, for example, but the entire path to adulthood and even being an adult still shapes your attachment style and how you relate to people. And anyone that has deep traumas can still heal from attachment wounds. It's just not necessarily easy. The way we're nurtured impacts our sense of intimacy and our social connectedness, and it builds the depth, warmth, and trust that we have. And I think it's a very interesting fact that because humans are so much more dependent than other species, it shows how much more nurture builds who we are compared even to other animals, and that clearly our genes are not at all our destiny. The crucial piece of software that's downloaded to us through experiences and nurture is our mindsets. The ability to be flexible in our thinking, solve problems creatively, and enjoy challenges and feel like there's just an abundance of positive ways to deal with problems is something we learn from others. Conversely, if we feel like failure is a bad thing to be avoided, like we only have one shot at making something work and that we are judged by our performance, that again is something we are taught by our family, our teachers, the people we're around. And as we get older and more entrenched in our habits, the harder it does become to change a behavior. But of course, nothing is set in stone. A 60-year-old can give up smoking. They can also learn a new language. We can absolutely still run software updates. My granddad got a smartphone in his 80s, and a few years later, he downloaded Facebook by himself. I didn't even tell him to, but next thing I know, I had my granddad adding me on Facebook. I was like, oh, hey. If you have a growth mindset attitude, at any age, you can still learn things. Sure, you might not like some of the music the kids listen to these days, but the only thing that stops you from keeping up is your belief that you can't keep up anymore. So, as we've seen so far, the concept of a fixed mindset doesn't match up at all with how the brain operates and learns new information. Neurologically speaking, we are capable of making new connections and improving at anything by building or updating our neural circuitry. Whether you can't juggle or you come across socially awkward, perhaps you're bad at controlling your emotions, these things aren't a destiny if you choose to work on them. So I thought we'd go to a very fundamental level of what are the two main ways we learn and influence our brain wiring. The first is bottom up. That's using our 5 senses to interpret the environment around us. What we see, hear, touch, smell, taste, that activates different neurons, which inputs information into our brains. This podcast, for example, is hopefully teaching you something, and that's purely information being learned through my voice projecting into your ears. Your brain is then doing something with that information. It might be adding to something that's already there, rewiring it, or forgetting some of it. Possibly, hopefully not. Now, of course, it's easy to think about learning information from our senses, that is, when it comes to something like education and reading and listening. But of course, things like touch, hugging, smells of people, they also teach us stuff. A crazy fact is that after shaking hands with someone, within 20 seconds, you will rub your face to gauge what their pheromones are saying, and you won't even notice yourself doing it. But since I learned this fact, I have watched lots of people I've shaken hands with and seen them all rub their face, and I'm like, oh my God, they're doing it. It's crazy. Sorry, that was a tangent that was sort of related. Anyway, the point is, our environment teaches us stuff, and the more things we do, the more we learn. It's obvious that if we can't currently ski and we go skiing, then we're probably going to learn how to ski. It's unobvious that if we hang out with the same friends we always hang out with, that there are social expectations around who we are stopping us from being someone else. It's unobvious that we can learn to show up in different ways, perhaps. But if we fill our sensual experiences with different stimuli, perhaps by hanging out with new friends, who maybe even have better pheromones, well, that can teach us new ways of being ourselves. Well, before I go too far with this, let's now address the top-down model of how we influence ourselves, and that is internal introspection through our own thoughts. We can activate neural circuitry ourselves simply through our own imagination. Purely self-awareness and noticing how we react to different scenarios and replaying them. You might replay conversations to think how to show up better socially, or maybe you even want to establish dominance, or maybe you want to be funnier. These are things you can work on internally. I taught myself tricks skiing by using my imagination and picturing what I'd actually need to do in the air to get my body to do what I wanted it to. And it actually worked. Now, of course, what we learn from this is that if you want to spend time working more actively on how to improve your brain and the decisions you make, then things like journaling or meditating make a lot of sense. Also, engaging in conversations with close ones or therapists and talking about what your brain does in different scenarios and what you'd like it to do is a way to change how your brain works. And I do always like hearing commonly good advice, but from a way that actually makes it relatable and from a new angle that actually makes it feel a bit more inspiring, because we've all heard we need to do more meditating and journaling, and finding a different way to make it interesting to at least hear why you should do it, I think is worth doing. So yes, but back to the grand conclusion, we find that we can change our abilities, and the only thing that keeps us fixed in our ability is the belief that we can't change. And that belief has nothing to do with reality. Sure, you might not become Michael Jordan, but you can still get better at basketball. Our mind is constantly updating, whether you believe it is or not. You have no choice in the matter. At least if you realize that it is changing, you can choose to push your brain to change in ways that you want it to by using your own top-down control, rather than just being at the mercy of your environment and inputs. And I think that's a really important lesson for anybody. So now that we've gone deeper into how the brain learns and grows, it's a good time to explain how mindsets are built, coming up after the break. A fun fact is that a bad hire can cost a company up to 30% of the employee's first year earnings. I can tell you that there is nothing like a bad hire for messing up morale. But if you run a small business, you also don't have endless time and resources for hiring, and that's where LinkedIn comes in. I have honestly found their tools the best way to find the right people faster and for free. It isn't just a job board, it is the best known professional network on the planet with over 1 billion members. Each month, 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit another job site, so if you aren't looking on LinkedIn, you're probably looking in the wrong place. In fact, 2.5 million small businesses use LinkedIn for hiring, and 86% of them get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/growth. That is linkedin.com/growth to post your job for free. And like all the best things in life, terms and conditions apply. For 30,000 years, men have been wrestling with their hair. Archaeological records show that they even used sharpened clamshells and shark teeth to deal with it. In fact, shaving wasn't popularized until Alexander the Great forced all of his men to shave so that their opponents couldn't grab their beards in battle. The good news is you can put away the flint knives and stop hacking away at your body jungles, because the new Manscaped Lawnmower 5.0 has arrived and it is amazing. I love being able to just take it in the shower, and as I'm a runner and a cyclist, not having the post-shave itch is just heaven. You can step up your grooming game and experience precision like never before with dual skin-safe blade technology, so you don't accidentally chop off anything you're not supposed to be chopping off. Hair today, gone tomorrow. Be a cut above the rest with Manscaped, and they are offering listeners of the show 20% off any order and free shipping with the promo code GROWTH, or visit manscaped.com/growth. Links are in the description. That's manscaped.com/growth to sort out all your hairy situations. The largest ever book burning in history occurred in 213 BC in China. Ordered by Emperor Qin Shi Huang, he sought to suppress intellectual freedom. Well, my sponsor Shortform are on the opposite mission. They are helping unlock the multitude of ideas stored in the world's best non-fiction books. Shortform is by far my favorite book summary app because they really care about information density. A light, fluffy book only needs a short summary, but a dense book with a lot of difficult ideas can't be summarized in just 15 minutes. Short-form summaries are built for the intellectually curious people out there who truly want to learn and understand things, and Shortform even have downloadable PDFs and quizzes to test your knowledge. Long story short, Shortform is where it's at. Listeners of the show get a free trial and 20% off their annual subscriptions at shortform.com/psychology. Link in the description. That is shortform.com/psychology for a free trial and 20% off an annual subscription. A mindset is essentially a belief, which is a thought, and a belief is a thought that we've had many, many times, to the point that we've trained it to automation. In the same way, when you know how to walk, you don't question how to move your leg or balance your body, you just walk. Your brain needs to conserve energy and process the world at speed, so we lay down our myelination to automate or semi-automate activities. And these things become autopilot. It's how we get through the world, by automating and reducing decisions. Now, if something from our environment affects us in some way, it triggers different neural circuitry in our body and into our brain. The first time you ever learned about maths, you didn't think, I'm good at maths or I'm bad at maths. You just went, ooh, maths, what's this? But if you did find it hard, and maybe when you spoke to your parents, they reassured you that they were really bad at maths and it doesn't matter that much, and then you failed your exams and continue to fail them, well, then you are training the belief that you are bad at maths. Whenever maths comes into your environment, you have a very well-trained belief that gets fired, reminding you how bad at maths you are before you even look at it. At this point, there is no question or decision going on about whether you are good or not at maths. That is already an accepted fact. So how does that happen? The more a neural pathway fires, the more myelinated it becomes, which makes the signal travel much faster, and it prevents interruption happening to the signal, and it basically blocks your ability to make a decision or consider different options. Instead of deciding things, we just know things. In the same way you don't decide how to walk, you know how to walk. In fact, it's not just our opinions on maths and walking, it happens for how we think about people. You might know that Dave is egotistical and Rita is kind and friendly. Those pathways have been fired repeatedly for you, and they've become trained because you spend so much time with them. You don't need to work out what you think about these people anymore when you meet them. You just have your knowledge about them. Now, yes, of course, you can question your beliefs, but it's often hard to change the belief. If you were to see egotistical Dave being kind, well, that's probably because of his ego and he's just trying to make people like him more. If we see Rita perhaps chasing fame, that's because she's so kind and she deserves to be recognized. However, let's say Dave jumps into a raging river to save our cat. We might decide that he is okay after all. And if it turns out that Rita has been human trafficking children, we might decide she probably isn't that kind of person. So the good news here is that myelination and developed neural pathways is not complete game over for new ways of thinking. It just requires a much bigger effort to change an opinion. And back to what a mindset is, mindsets serve as much grander opinions or meta opinions that sit on top of our direct opinions and direct how our new opinions are formed. If you believe in the growth mindset and that people can change, you would be more open to the idea that Dave was egotistical when you met him and perhaps bad in social settings, but he could still change his ways at any time because we know that people can grow. A growth mindset would override your feeling of being bad at maths because it isn't easy. And the growth mindset would remind you that effort and difficulty is what builds intelligence, and you'd be happy to fail and learn about why you made those mistakes in your maths class so you could get better at them instead of just giving up and accepting that you're bad at it. So mindsets are basically grand opinions that help us decide how we make opinions at a day-to-day level. So now we've covered a little bit about how opinions are built and that mindsets are essentially overarching opinions. We can look a bit at how to change our brain. And the biggest thing here is, simply put, mistakes grow brains. Like we saw with our opinions about Luke and Rita, when we found out about a giant mistake in our opinions that we'd made about them, that grew a new connection in our brain to change our opinion about them. Dave saving our cat, Rita being a human trafficker, those were some big mistakes compared to our current opinions about them, and very powerfully taught us new lessons about them. And mistakes are very powerful teachers. Let's go back to learning to walk and talk. Doing both of these things are initially very complex. It's taken humanity years to be able to teach robots to do both of those things, and robots still aren't brilliant and they're not very robust or natural at doing them. The act of not just thinking the right words to say, but also passing air through your vocal cords and mouth to make the exact right sound, including the correct emotional tones and cadence, that is a complex task. It's the same with walking. The exact right movement whilst keeping your body balanced, shifting your weight around. It's really hard to do with just two legs. But it's the act of failing at these things, fumbling around, falling over, that teaches us what not to do. Your brain uses lots of brain glucose just to process everything that's going on. In fact, it uses 25% of your body's entire glucose demands. And every time your brain tries something that doesn't work, it fails, that's an open pathway that can be shut down. And I'll explain what that means. If you imagine a baby that has no concept of gravity, it's just trying everything. It's putting its arms and legs everywhere. And then as it starts falling over, it learns essential lessons about gravity, and it learns about its own personal relationship to gravity, depending on where it puts its legs and arms. It starts to develop a sense of its internal center of mass. As the baby does this, it's reducing millions of potential options it has to consider to simply one way of how gravity works. It doesn't need to think about gravity anymore. It just knows what gravity does and how it works. And then it starts working out ways that it can put its legs underneath it to stand still. And maybe it can shift its balance forward and it moves forwards, but it falls over when it does that. But if it can catch itself by putting another leg out, then these are all pathways that get myelinated as quickly as possible so that the baby can stop thinking about all this crazy how to walk stuff and automate it, and it can move on to new things. All these mistakes are growing the brain. Stanford have done a really cool research project where they've shown that specific electrochemical activity in the brain only occurs, in fact, when we're making mistakes. And this is really to do with necessity. When we struggle, there is failing and not doing well at something. That is a really good indication of when your brain needs to learn something and do something about it. That inspires your brain to work hard and activate things that weren't activated before. That's why if you want to learn a language, it's so fast if you are immersed with native speakers, because you are constantly fumbling for words, and quickly over time, your brain is building those connections. If you just sit at home using Duolingo and you look at the reminders, there isn't that much fumbling and failing. It's not a giant priority for your brain to sort that out. Your brain isn't there going, oh crap, tomorrow I need to have all these words sorted so that people don't think I'm stupid. You're like, yeah, Duolingo is going to be easy on me again tomorrow, so I can forget it. And thus, you don't become fluent, unless you're doing a lot more failing. The good thing about this is that we can reframe failure and what mistakes mean. By far, my biggest learnings in life are from my failures. How to run a business was learned by running a business really badly. Things that make me truly happy were learned from chasing the wrong things. I always say that you can't teach anyone to ride a bike with theory. Like, someone could study a degree on the physics of riding a bike for years, but they would still fall off the bike as soon as they got on one the first time. It is the act of trying and failing that teaches you to ride a bike, and it's the same with maths, life goals, relationships, etc. Mistakes are just the necessary ingredient for doing something new and acquiring skills. So that means we can celebrate mistakes. And if we learn to do that, we can enjoy engaging in difficult things. We can enjoy much higher levels of engaging in difficult things and thus learning things. To learn to juggle, I forced myself to try for 10 minutes every day with a timer, because after 2 minutes of dropping balls, it gets a bit boring. But if you just set 10 minutes to force yourself to drop them, after a week of dropping balls for 10 minutes every day, I started to get better. Just accepting that dropping balls was going to be part of learning meant I could do it continuously for 10 minutes and not feel like I was wasting time or just destined to always be terrible at juggling. It is kind of frustrating that school doesn't teach us this at all. It teaches us that mistakes are bad, and we don't like looking dumb. We don't like asking stupid questions in front of others. And in fact, we get taught that putting in effort means that we probably aren't very good at something naturally. And it's only people who achieve things effortlessly who are going to go somewhere in that field. The reality, of course, is that mistakes indicate that we are moving into new territory. And that is where growth happens. And yes, I will address that people can go way too far and celebrate mistakes too much. If you always fail your maths test, like 1 + 1 = 3, that isn't exactly a celebratory event. If you're not even trying to learn anything, but you still get rewarded for showing up, that does miss the point. Now, when I was talking about my juggling, yes, I accepted I was going to drop my juggling balls the entire time, but the important thing was that I still tried to catch them every single time. And there's a big difference in failing to get the right answer and not trying to get the right answer. Because when you're learning to walk, you are always trying and failing to achieve your goal. Not trying to walk is just crawling, and you're never going to learn to walk by that. Yes, you are failing to walk, but you're failing to even try to walk. It's the falling over and making mistakes rather than the failing to succeed. In the same way, if you go to a foreign country and don't try to learn the language, you don't magically become fluent just by being there. Immersion still requires you to actively try and fail to talk the language every day. So to wrap this all up, as I said at the start, young kids naturally have a growth mindset. And it's only as we become more self-aware that we realize people are watching us, we become self-conscious about judgments and mistakes. And then when that gets combined with a concept that talent and skills are maybe innate, we start to forego our ability to develop them. If we're worried about our social status or value in a group due to our skills, we worry even more about it. If we want to do something and we find it hard, we can find ourselves believing that we aren't able to do it because we are inherently not good at it and not capable at developing. And that's the root of where all the fixed mindset beliefs come from. The most important thing we have to do is just recognize our capacity as humans to develop and grow, simply because that is what you are built to do. Trying and making mistakes will build your brain architecture. You can't learn to ride a bike without falling, and it is the same for anything. Often, the higher your rate of failure, the faster you'll learn. I developed really fast at skiing by pushing myself to fall over twice a day and just doing things that I couldn't do. Now, of course, we can get into a whole new debate here about comfort zones and not going too far, like you wouldn't learn to drive a car in a Ferrari. But we'll save that for another time. Remember that we are all flexible and creative problem solvers, and that's literally what you're built for. We can evolve and grow our minds and activate new circuitry and change old wiring at any age. A fixed mindset is simply an incorrect belief about how the neurology of your brain even works. It only exists because we believe that a specific trait is fixed, or we more generally believe that effort and difficulty is just a sign of our inability. So celebrate your mistakes if you actually tried, because that's how we learn, and practice some of your own top-down self-reflection to improve your inputs and put yourself into more situations where you learn things. And that is all I've got for today. Thanks for listening. I will be putting a series together all about the main different mindsets and the growth mindset. I'm tentatively calling it Carol Dweck and the Multiverse of Mindsets because it made me chuckle. So you can look forward to that. Have a great week and keep growing and keep learning.
Hi everyone, I'm Ingrid.
And I'm Leslie.
And we are best friends and hosts of the Declutter Hub podcast.
If you feel overwhelmed by the clutter in your home, then you need the Declutter Hub podcast in your life. Our show is the perfect combination of delving into your emotional connection to clutter and suggesting practical how-tos.
With a no-nonsense approach and a bit of fun thrown into the mix, we get to the heart of what's holding you back from having a home you're proud of and works like clockwork every day. Listen wherever you get your podcasts or search for the Declutter Hub.